Madam President, I am here to speak in opposition to the offset in IOT Amendment number 2603. The bipartisan budget that passed in December included a Republican provision that changed the annual cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, for military retirees. I oppose that provision, and I believe there is bipartisan support for repealing it. The main question that needs to be debated is how to pay for that repeal. Amendment 2603 would pay for fixing the military retiree COLA problem by denying the refundable child tax credit to millions of eligible U.S. citizen children. That amendment asks, in effect, whether military retirees are more deserving of help than U.S. citizen children who are on the edge of poverty. That is a false choice. That is not the right approach. The child tax credit is one of our most important programs to reduce child poverty. Tens of millions of families claim the child tax credit each year. More than 35 million families in 2009, both using Social Security numbers and individual taxpayer identification numbers. According to the Congressional Research Service, the child tax credit reduces child poverty by approximately 1/5. For such an important and widely used program as this, we should be careful that any changes we make to the program does not harm low-income children and working families. And many of these low-income families are headed by women. Any large program is susceptible to fraud and misuse. When fraud is alleged, the cases should be investigated and the people who commit fraud should be punished. This means targeted, aggressive auditing and enforcement, not wholesale changes to the program that will deny help to kids who are legally receiving it today. The proponents of the amendment tell us that individuals are fraudulently claiming the child tax credit for kids who live in Mexico or for kids who do not exist. That is already a violation of the law. This is fraud. I agree with the amendment sponsor that we should take steps to prevent this fraud. But the IRS says this amendment would not solve the fraud problem. In 2012, 5 senators wrote to the IRS regarding this matter, and the letter asked, quote, "Does the fact that a person filing the return has a Social Security number indicate whether the child claimed for the credit met the residency requirements required under the law," end quote. And the response from IRS in a letter dated July 20th, 2012 was, quote, "The possession of an SSN or Social Security number by the filer is not relevant in determining whether the child met the residency requirements." In other words, imposing a Social Security number requirement does not prevent the fraud that the amendment sponsor seeks to prevent. And that makes intuitive sense. If a person is going to lie about the existence of a kid, they'll lie about the SSN too. So this amendment does not solve the problem. If this amendment doesn't solve the problem, then what would the real impact of this amendment be? Here's what the amendment would do. First, it would deny help to roughly 4 million U.S. citizen children from low-income households by making their families ineligible for the child tax credit. The average family claiming the refundable child tax credit earns only about $21,000 a year. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these families are led by women. Every dollar matters to these families. The child tax credit lifts roughly 1.5 million children out of poverty each year, and this amendment would plunge many of these children back into poverty. I want to emphasize that because of how the child tax credit is structured in the tax code, only working families are eligible for the refundable portion. These families are working and paying taxes, but in lean years, they would be denied help from the child tax credit if this amendment were to become law. They are paying taxes, but would be denied help. This is not fair. Second, this amendment would render these 4 million U.S. children second-class citizen status because of who their parents are. That is contrary to the principle of equality on which this country was founded. All citizens should be treated fairly and equally. This amendment says some citizen children will receive help and others won't, depending on who their parents are. That is simply not right. In closing, there is a better way to pay for repealing the military retiree COLA provision that was included in the budget, and that is to close corporate tax loopholes. The proponents cite a news report from Indiana, which an undocumented worker admitted that he'd allow 4 other undocumented workers to use his address to file tax returns. The 4 workers did not live there, but he allowed them to use his address anyway. I agree, this is fraud and should be stopped. But this story reminds me of the story of the Ugland House in the Cayman Islands. The Ugland House is a 5-story building that has been identified as the official address for 18,857 companies, all at the same time. Some of the inhabitants of this address are some of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States. As I understand it, this is not a violation of U.S. laws. Tens of thousands of corporations can legally use the same building for their official address. It is not fraud, but merely tax planning, I'm told. Offshore mailing addresses and accounting tricks are allowing corporations to shelter enormous profits from U.S. taxes. According to Bloomberg News, 83 of the largest companies in the U.S. held $1.46 trillion in profits offshore in 2012. Another report by J.P. Morgan Chase estimates the amount of offshore profits is even higher, nearly $1.7 trillion. How does this work? One thing corporations do is funnel their revenues through shell companies to escape taxation. According to the Center for American Progress, countries like Bermuda, Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, which combined account for less than half of 1% of the world's population, generated 43% of the profits reported by American companies in 2008. Clearly, there is a major tax problem here. So while our colleagues rail against 5 workers using one address to file taxes, we hear nothing about more than 18,000 companies that have used one address to file their taxes. Talk about egregious. These corporate tax loopholes resulting in huge amount of taxes corporations don't pay are what this Congress should focus on, not on denying a few $100s of help to a U.S. citizen child who is on the edge of poverty. Senator Shaheen has filed an amendment that begins to address these corporate tax problems. Her amendment, number 2618, of which I am a co-sponsor, will prevent more than 18,000 corporations from pretending that they are headquartered in a single building in the Cayman Islands. Like Senator Ayat's amendment, the Shaheen amendment will repeal the military retiree COLA provision that was in the budget deal. The difference is Senator Shaheen's amendment would pay for the repeal by holding corporations accountable for the taxes they owe, instead of denying help to U.S. citizen children of working parents, many of whom are women, who are in poverty. We all recognize that we have a responsibility to our veterans, taxpayers, and to future generations. Senator Shaheen's amendment will allow us to meet all of these commitments at the same time. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this common sense approach and vote in favor of the Shaheen amendment and not the Ayat amendment. I yield back.